All right, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us. Bit of housekeeping real quick. We are having a happy hour today at 5 o'clock outside on the terrace. So if anyone is still around, wants to hang out with us, please do. And yeah, I think we'll get right into it. Excited to have this conversation here with Andy Loughnane, president of Austin FC, the most popular, most successful, best major pro team in Austin.
Don't tell them we're the only one.
and Kyle Christensen, chief marketing officer at Pointsbet. A really fun topic here, and there's a lot of ways I think we can go with this. But I want to start, Kyle, with you from a 30,000-foot view. I'm curious how healthy you think this industry is, sports betting. I flew in from New York. We did $2 billion worth of handle in the first month of sports betting in New York. A massive number. Seems great. Public markets, things are not going so great for a lot of the publicly traded sports betting companies. I'm curious how you see the health of the industry right now.
Yeah, I'm gonna answer that in a couple different ways. One, I think the health of the industry from a consumer perspective is strong, right? You know, the more and more states that come online and the more people get to understand, you know, how to responsibly place wagers on sports, you know, we're really in, to use a sports analogy, the first inning, right? And so that's exciting. On another end of the spectrum, there is a little bit of concern from my perspective, and again, I've only been in the industry for 5 months now, but I am seeing some troubling patterns as far as marketing and promotion, and I think from the perspective of maybe the top 4 books, the FanDuels, the DraftKings, the MGMs and Caesars, these guys all have billion-dollar marketing budgets and sort of have gone scorched earth to get as many people through their doors as possible. I'm not here to say that strategy is right or wrong, but what I'm afraid of is that it's creating a little bit of bad consumer habits. We were speaking a little bit earlier, but I saw a stat when New York first came online that if you were to take the promotions across those 4 books, you could get roughly $15,000 in free bets. Now, a lot of consumers will never spend $15,000 in their lifetime on sports betting, let alone getting this sort of free money. And I'm afraid that it turns into a little bit of promo chasing and doesn't create as much customer loyalty, or we'll see a lot of churn. And you already are starting to see that in markets like New York, right? And so how do we continue to, what I think is ultimately our job, the same way that fantasy sports did for sports, but how can sports betting actually enhance the experience overall?
So much of that resonates with me because I, in New York, didn't make $15,000, but I did sign up for all these things, took all the free bets, took a lot of money out, and it was a really easy process, and I made some money. But now I open up the apps, and the free bets aren't there, and I'm like, wait, what's going on here? I thought every Knicks game I got a free $10 or $50 free roll on that. Why isn't that happening? From a PointsBet perspective, you guys are doing things a little bit differently.
Yep.
How are you approaching new markets differently than what we're seeing from some of your competitors?
Yeah, well, I'll just say, first of all, we're not spending $1 billion in marketing. So I mean, listen, I wish I had that problem. We just don't at the moment. So what we're really trying to do is be disciplined and concise in who we market to. So we found a really nice, what I would say, underserved core betting audience that makes up roughly 50% of all the handle that comes in. We've tailored our promo, our product, our partnerships, everything we do based around that, and that's kind of like the in-house focus of how can we go after these core consumers, because listen, at the end of the day, we can't compete with the likes of FanDuel and how they go to mass market and tap into their fantasy database, but we also don't want to. Listen, they can have some of what I'd say is the lower betting consumer that comes in, like, please, go for FanDuel and use some of their promos that they build out. We're really trying to tailor our product and our experience and our partnerships, whether it's with NBC or Austin FC, to make sure that it's to the experience more engaged, better overall. And we're starting to see some really good lift.
You mentioned the team partnerships there. Andy, you've worked in front offices in many different sports. I'm curious, have you ever seen an industry just kind of pop up like this before. And not just an industry where there's a lot of money being spent, but also a new way to talk to your fans in a sense, right? It's not just a new category, it's also just a new engagement tool as well.
I mean, it is relatively unprecedented, but you can't ignore the spend levels, not just on the sponsorship side, but what it is just, to a local economy. And for reference, Pointsbet and Austin FC are partners. It's unique because the state of Texas, it's not legal to sports bet. It's something that, I don't know, what's the number? It's like 33 states today are either passed or in the trajectory of definitely passing legislation. I think our forecast is closer to 40 maybe by this time next year. But Texas is not one of the states that has thus either advanced legislation, let alone passed it. So we're in a unique position, Pointsbet and Austin FC, in that we've literally entered into a partnership where we're helping them build a brand in a market that I think we all anticipate will one day join that list. But nonetheless, the industry is fortunate, I guess, if you're in our position, that there is this demand, and there was a little bit of a competitive demand in the process of identifying a partner. We're certainly not the only team in Major League Sports to have gone through that process, but if we're being fair, that is to our advantage as we go through that process.
Can we break down how the partnership came together? What were you guys looking for on the PointsBet side? What were you looking for on the Austin FC side? How long did it go down? Walk us through kind of how those negotiations happened.
You want me to take that first?
Yeah, I mean, I was not part of the deal because I only came on 5 months ago. So I think, Andy, you could speak to the process, but I'm more than happy to dig in on why Austin is a great fit.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
So there's actually somebody in this room, Chris, in the back of the room, helped the club organize what was essentially, let's call it, the list of likely candidates that we would want to talk to in the state of Texas. And for us, we were having the same conversations that the other 10 major league teams in the state, so NBA, NHL, NFL, MLB, we're all having the same conversations that we were having. And so I think there was probably a period of time, and this goes back about a year and a half ago, where we started to have, let's call it, multiple conversations a day. And in the case of Pointsbet and Austin FC, so Pointsbet USA's CEO is a guy named Johnny Aiken, and Johnny and Chris and I would start to have routine conversations along with some of the chief commercial officer, the chief commercial officer role, his counterpart, Eric. And at the end of the day, as we go through those conversations, and there were literally 30 to 40 different entities, whether they were a traditional land-based casino that has a sports betting product, or a technology platform that has a sports betting product, or a new company that's perhaps a little more classified as fly-by-night. Maybe they're in a country in the Middle East and they're relatively new. Those are the conversations you have to navigate. And I think we were fortunate in that Austin is a relatively unique proposition. We are the only major league team in this market. I don't know, by way of hands, how many people here live in Austin? Okay, not a lot. So, that's
Some people would say the Longhorns are a professional team.
That's right.
As well.
There's a lot of good jokes in there. But I do think that, we provide a different opportunity. Imagine if you're Pointsbet and you align with, let's just say, one of the major league teams in Dallas. Dallas has all of the other major league sports, and there's an opportunity perhaps that you become a little diluted. You become less relevant in that space. In our case, we have very fortunately been able to capture the attention of the city. I mean, we're growing and we're new, so I don't want to misrepresent our sizing, but on the other hand, we do have a unique position. We are allowed to carry the voice of the major league properties in this city. So to bring it to a close, ultimately we were able to find commonality, and that was through a pretty rigorous bidding process because there was a lot of other interested parties.
I don't want to go too far off tangent, Andy, but it's not lost on me that you were part of the original group that launched the Columbus Blue Jackets, the first pro franchise in a city dominated by a local college. And then flash forward to your job now, you're launching Austin FC, the first pro team in a city dominated by a local college. How does that interplay work? I assume it's a little bit different, kind of coming in when there's other pro franchises versus coming in when there is a very large incumbent college franchise whose partnerships kind of strike a different chord, or they happen a little bit differently than pro teams.
Now I have to ask, is there anybody here from Columbus? Okay. I was 24, 25 when I was in Columbus helping launch the Blue Jackets. I was a sponsorship seller, and we had a very interesting approach back then, and this is the year 2000. And our approach was, we're a major league team, an NHL team. We're a major league team. Do they know who we think we are? And we were very arrogant. And it was not the sort of the mindset that I established. I was kind of a foot soldier, but nonetheless, that was the organization's mindset, that we were very confident in that sponsors and the city would embrace a major league team in the same way, and perhaps even in an exceeding way to that of a college football team. I mean, again, to look back 20 years later, it's somewhat, it's almost preposterous. But nonetheless, that was the mindset, and I raised that for two reasons. One, at the time we said, when we were in Columbus, we said we were the only major league property in the city. Interesting, because the Crew at that time had existed for 4 to 5 years, just puts it in perspective where soccer was in the ecosystem 20, 25 years ago. But also I raised that because it was an incredible learning lesson for me personally. And so now, fast forward to the opportunity to launch Austin FC, and we got our charter in 2019, I had a very different experience. I had a mindset I was able to understand what to never do ever again. And so we were able to correct that mistake. And it may have been natural to me anyway to never try to have this sort of arrogant attitude, but it was important that I had that foundation.
Interesting. So going back to the PointsBet stuff, how different are your conversations with PointsBet versus other companies? Obviously, price is a factor here, but are companies offering something drastically different when you're having these conversations about who your sports betting partner is going to be? So each of them does have, let's call it, whether it's the business model or in the case of PointsBet, the business model, the technology, and the track record. And so there's a lot of companies that have short track records, whether that's a short track record in just globally or a short track record in the United States. In the case of PointsBet, I can't remember how many states at the time you would have had, let's call it a year ago.
Like 5 or 6.
That sounds about right. But states where they were acquiring market share against very stiff competition. And for those of you, I'm imagining you're familiar, that in particular, DraftKings, FanDuel came out of the gates in many of these states with incredible databases based off just sort of the daily fantasy space. And they had a head start, more or less, with many of the players in these states. But PointsBet established themselves, in particular at the time, in New Jersey, a market not terribly dissimilar in terms of the opportunity to have a huge handle. They were outperforming a lot of the players in New Jersey, and that was a very important data point for us. The other, if you're familiar with this space, PointsBet approaches their technology differently, and this is more for Kyle to address, but they own their own technology, which is not the case for most of their competitors. That is an enormous competitive advantage. Also, it's just easy to use. And so it's very user-friendly. And again, going back to track record, they've been around for a while. They're Australian-based. They've been successful overseas, and they were successful in the United States. So the combination of all those factors, it was a pretty simple, and I would call it straightforward decision for us.
Kyle, to that point, walk us through why it matters to own your own tech stack. I think a lot of people might hear that and think, oh, is that actually a factor? Why would I, as a consumer, notice that? But tell us why that actually matters.
Well, I'll just say, Andy, if it doesn't work out at Austin FC, you can come over to PointsBet because you basically nailed everything there. Listen, we go back to our consumer focus at the end of the day, right? And if you own your own tech stack, you're able to really pivot on a dime. We anticipate, again, looking at historical references, but mature markets like Australia and the UK, where sports betting has been legal for 30, 40 years, live in-game betting is basically 80% of all the bets that come in. Right now in the US, we're only 40 to 50%, but that's continuing to climb up and up and up and up. And so, for example, for March Madness, us owning our own tech stack, we're able to create live betting functionality that'll be rolled out for March Madness, where we have essentially 60 different bets that you could place, whereas our next competition, I think, is DraftKings, and they only have roughly 30. But in order for somebody who doesn't own their tech stack to do it, they have to reach out to the third party that's licensing it, basically put it on a product roadmap. Whereas in-house, we can go to our product and tech team and say, hey, we've got feedback from consumer X or a cohort of Y, and they really want to do this. Do we think we can change it in time? And it's a simple yes or no question. So the ability to sort of adapt to what our consumer wants, and again, like going back to that focus, we really feel that's how we build out loyalty and retention. And again, we're starting to see that come to fruition.
I spent some time doing some price shopping in New York when I was like, oh, maybe I'll become a serious sports bettor. And I noticed, obviously, that PointsBet also often has different numbers.
Yep.
The markets are different. And that is often because a lot of the other people have been using the same tech back-end provider, so they end up having identical lines. You guys, if you're someone who cares about that, looking for an edge in that way, it's also more customer friendly in that way as well.
Well, to that point too, we have our own traders in-house as well. So, right, we set our own lines. We have confidence in everybody across the board to be able to set in their knowledge-based understanding of the industry, but also to set competitive lines. Whereas, again, to your point on the back end, when you're using third-party data to aggregate everything together, you kind of have to go with the flow, whereas we can see trends and say, we'll shave a point or we'll shave half a point or something here and see if we can get more people engaged.
So this is a good transition to the two-word phrase that I think I hear the most in this industry right now, which is product wins.
Yep.
And I'll be totally honest, I've become kind of skeptical about that in the short term. It seems like, and going back, tying in what we talked at the beginning, it seems like in some ways the people throwing the most money out right now are winning, quote unquote, from a market share standpoint. I assume that you guys are thinking about product winning as a long-term thing. And if you don't mind, drill down into what product winning means, right? There's UX experience, there's offering more lines, there's doing different kinds of promos. When you think of product, what exactly what are the most important parts of that word?
Yeah, I'll answer that in two ways too, but I think, listen, we've really taken on this sort of David versus Goliath sort of mantra within the building, and within that, we're trying to think of ways to innovate outside of, it's great that we have 60 plus markets for March Madness, but does everybody really need 60 plus markets? Probably not, but where we'd like to think and differentiate ourselves is through partnerships. So like our partnership with NBC, for example, we look to innovate in those spaces in where an app itself might be similar if you would swap out some colors and everything flowed great. The average consumer couldn't really tell the difference. But where we like to lean in, for example, we're the first sportsbook to be integrated into the Super Bowl. We're doing these things called betcasts with our RSNs in Philly and Chicago, and basically creating a telecast where it's just focused on betting. So instead of live coverage about the game itself, it's live coverage about what bets and props are going on. And I think that's a way to innovate across the board that inserts your product into what's going on in the game itself. And we're seeing incremental lift there. We see 5x handle when we do that. We see 2x increase of players who actually come in and use the app and get people to sign up.
That's 5 times more people are betting on through your app on the games that you have those betcasts going.
5 times the amount of dollars
bet, yeah.
that come in. Yeah. So sorry, handle means just basically the amount of dollars, but
so why not do that for every game?
That's a good question. I mean, you don't want to completely take over the experience. Obviously, our partners in Chicago and Philly and throughout the country with NBC have done something right. But to your point, we saw an increase in viewership across this too. So it's finding the right balance. It's finding the right ways to innovate with partners. And listen, we're always trying to innovate with the product itself too. But how do you enhance that overall experience? I keep going back to is one of the things that we're really focused on.
So I'll tell you guys a quick story, and you'll know where I'm going with this. I grew up in North Jersey, and my entire childhood, we were getting ads for Sonic, the burger joint. Always on television. There was not a Sonic within 200 or 300 miles of where I grew up. And I always thought it was the dumbest thing that they were advertising to me when I couldn't go to a Sonic. When I was in high school, the Sonic opened on Route 3. It had a line of cars outside the Sonic for the first 6 months. We had all been primed to think about Sonic, and you can look it up, this is a Sonic marketing strategy. They will very often advertise in places where their product is not available, knowing that they're going to be there eventually, and people are going to be ready to line up on the highway to get to Sonic. Rough kind of comparison, Kyle, to what you guys are going through, but right now your core product is not available in Texas. What do you do, and Andy, I want to get your thoughts here on how Austin FC helps, but what do you do in the meantime, whether it's going to be 2 years, or in a worst case scenario, a bit longer than that. What do you do in the meantime to make sure that Texans, when, if they are able to gamble on sports, that PointsBet is one of the names they think of first when they're ready to sign up?
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's a great question, and I think we're just scratching the surface on what kind of partnership this can be. We've opened a PointsBet bar within the stadium itself, and we have our signage everywhere, but it's really about sitting down and understanding the partner, what their business goals are, what they're trying to achieve. I mean, listen, you guys have taken the city by storm. If you guys have ever been to a game, you understand it is absolute madness in the best way possible. And so how do we kind of bottle that fever? And again, I go back to enhancing the sport experience. Like, how can we take sports betting and make that an even stronger position for Austin FC, and how the fans engage and kind of just bring out a little bit more of that vigor that you see? So I don't have a straight answer for it, but I think it's just understanding their business goals. How can we help to maximize that and build off the momentum they've already established?
I can paint a little more color on that, because I think first of all, we kind of forecasted this opportunity even before we started construction. So we hadn't had conversations with the sports betting category players, but one of the things that we do think one day will happen, and it's happening in other parts in the country, is that it's possible that there might be sports books at stadiums in Texas. And so we've thought about that. We designed a space in the event that that makes sense for Austin FC, in the event that that makes sense for a partner, in the event that it becomes legal to do so. We at least wanted to be in the position to consider that. And so, that's one thoughtful aspect of the relationship. Again, that's not legal as of today. There's, in their business, acquiring customers comes from having data. So we're providing them with the opportunity to generate data collection. So we do things, whether it's in the PointsBet sports bar or online, social, being able to collect data in order to build out that customer database. And so, there's incentives in place for people to do that. I think that's relatively table stakey, but important mutually for us to begin to acquire customers who may be addressable at a later point in time. And by the way, we can talk about when we think they might be addressable. And also, media integration in particular, and he talked about those betcasts. PointsBet right now is integrated into all of our regional telecasts, so they are the presenting partner of our telecasts. And there's even some consideration in a legalization period. Do we consider adding live odds to a broadcast? That's going on all over the country. That is not a condition that would be unique to Texas. That's getting integrated everywhere on platforms. And so we would be far from the first to consider, let alone doing it. But at the end of the day, those are some of the conversations that we're having internally. We're not there yet, but we're talking about it. Are
there things you can't do? Are there restrictions on advertising during games? Are there things that you're not allowed to do quite yet that you're doing, or that Kyle, you guys would be able to do in other markets where you're operating?
Yeah, just and I don't know the sort of MLS bylaws, but I would say across the board, you do need to get league approvals. In particular, like, for example, we're not allowed to run national ads in-game for the NFL, right? But we have our integration with Football Night in America, and where we're able to talk about it and put up the live odds pre-game. NBA is a little bit more lenient, obviously, with our betcasts and what we're able to do there. With MLB opening back up, there's certain instances and ways where we're able to do pre-game and also integrations into, in between innings. But yeah, I think, listen, sky's the limit on what we can actually start to build out. But again, we're just kind of scratching the surface on how we do this. I want to make sure we do it correctly without inundating and flooding the markets with ads, because we've seen what that has done in past states, right? It's really created this high bar of brand awareness, but once that moment is gone, they churn out and move on to the next, and that's exactly what we don't want to do.
There are some technical considerations. For example, if your product is on an over-the-air station, you have different FCC guidelines that you need to adhere to in states where it's not legal. If it's a cable broadcast, it's a different situation, but we have to be careful with how it's scripted, positioned.
I don't know what it would be, Andy, but have you ever done a deal with a company that wasn't operating in your local market?
That's a great question. God, nothing to this magnitude, but just for everybody's comfort, I think this is a logical step, and we're not conducting anything that is in any way illicit or illegal. This is a brand building opportunity for a product that is likely going to be, or a service that is likely going to be made available at some point. Again, there's roughly 33 states today that are either legal or soon to be legal, and then again, our as an industry, as a major league sports industry in Texas, we think, the research we do, we think about 40 states right around this time next year.
I know if you both could, you'd snap your fingers and change the law right now. But realistically, Andy, what are we probably talking about in Texas? I know the legislature meets once every 2 years, which is a bit different than other states. But is 2 years from now realistic? Is that a pie in the sky? What exactly are you expecting?
So procedurally, as you pointed out, 2023 is the next legislative session in Texas, and so theoretically it can be presented as a bill for the House and the Senate to explore. That has not happened previously. There has not been legislation that has been moved through either the House or the Senate previously. So I think realistically there could be legislation that's at least evaluated by this next session. I think there's going to be, kind of a push for that. And so, yes, I anticipate in 2023 there being much more discussion around this topic than there was previously. Just so everybody understands, there is an illegal market that has been established in the state of Texas. So Texas, as one of the largest economies in the world, is very ripe right now for the illegal market to be heavily putting a lot of firepower into Texas. So you might actually, if you guys are in an Uber this week, you might have an ad presented to you that asks you to consider placing a bet with an offshore book. It's not legal. It carries a high amount of risk, and if you're a Texas legislator, you're probably wanting to look out for your constituents. And so this illegal market is something to be wary of because it is not reliable. That's one piece. And another piece is that, from a competitive perspective, let's just use the Dallas Cowboys, for example. The Dallas Cowboys, as successful as they are, they would want to be on a level playing field with other NFL teams. And so as a result of Texas not yet being there, there will be people who will want to try to be on as level of a playing field as possible.
I imagine both those things are part of the kind of lobbying effort going on in the state right now. I know there's a sports betting alliance here with all of the professional teams. Walk us through kind of what the plan is from a sports team perspective to kind of get that across to the people who matter.
So the 11 major league teams in the state, again, that's across the 5 major leagues in North America, the teams have created this alliance. We're conducting research and we're trying to educate. And it's important for us to uncover things like the illegal betting market or understand what we think is happening in other states and how it can best be positioned for consumer success. So the 11 teams, I think most days of the week, most topics would be like-minded. In this particular area, there's complete unanimity, or complete what's the right word? We're unanimous? Unanimity?
Unanimous, yeah.
Did I use that word right?
Yeah, you got it.
We're completely aligned on this particular subject, and I think that that's a strength. And again, there's a lot of major league properties that have existed in this state for a long time. We're the new kids, but I will say that the Dallas Cowboys, for example, have provided a lot of jobs and a lot of opportunity in the state of Texas. A lot of tourism with their facilities. There's a lot of interest in making sure that the Cowboys, their voice is heard, as an example.
Jerry seems like a good person to have on your side when you're trying to lobby for things in Texas.
And it's interesting because as the only major league property in Austin, sometimes we have the default of being a little closer to the legislative voice. But the teams are completely aligned on this subject.
Kyle, you mentioned that obviously when you guys go into new markets, you're competing against companies that are going to spend way more than you are. Mm-hmm. How does your approach in a state like Texas, where you have a multi-year runway, you've got some advertising here, you have a partner here, you can kind of slow play kind of the acquisition of the data. How does that compare to pick a state like Illinois where things go legal and you rush in and you're competing kind of immediately to get people onto your app with all of the other players?
Yeah, so the importance really is being at the starting line and being able to build out brand awareness prior to, knock on wood, whatever it is. In Texas, they say go, that we're there with all the competitors. One of the things that we're constantly chasing is I think DraftKings and FanDuel's and the like are a little bit ahead of that and sort of get first crack at a lot of states. And so
From an access standpoint.
From an access standpoint, and we come in a little bit late. So like, for example, New York, right? DraftKings and FanDuel were able to be, and Caesars at the starting line. MGM comes in a week later. We come in a week later after that. So it is important, but for us in particular, our brand is still relatively unknown, especially in states that aren't live. So we try and get out there a year or two beforehand and ensure that people understand, build trust, build consideration, and then ultimately make sure as much as possible that we're at the starting line and able to compete and get access to the market at the same time as everybody else because, again, we go back to our product and we believe that it's second to none. And so, really in a world where everybody's trying things out and the reality that they're going to have multiple apps and multiple books on their phone, that, after the first month or two, and we're starting to see this data, that you see a lot of retention in people when we're able to compete. But when we come into markets, for example, like Virginia, where we are a little bit late, it's harder to make up that ground. And so you kind of have to start out with a bang. And
do you prefer this model? Like, would you rather every state have kind of a longer runway that you can kind of get in, make partnerships, or would you rather just have kind of green grass in front of you?
I would like to have maybe a year, I'd say. When you talk about 3 years, you're just getting a little antsy.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think, listen, you got to get to know your market, get to know your partner, understand like the core objectives, start to build out the brand and understanding, and that takes at a minimum a year. But yeah, anything longer, you're just kind of chomping at the bit, and you want to make sure you're not wasteful with your resources too.
And you guys work with, you've mentioned a bunch of your partners. You have a big media partnership with NBC. You work with teams like Austin FC. You work with former athletes or current athletes, Paige Sporenic and Allen Iverson. How do you think about kind of each of those distribution points? What a team like Austin FC is better for this kind of thing? What do I want to use the individuals for this? What do I want to lean on NBC for? How do you think about those different channels and how you kind of maximize the value out of each of those?
Yeah, I mean, they each have their own separate strategy. We have a team that stood up across, whether it's partnerships or brands or content, and really going after sort of that audience in particular. But I think, like, for example, we are really leaning into content in particular on like social channels and things that we can own and start to build out our brand narrative and brand voice and seeing a lot of exponential growth in there, whereas maybe traditional channels like, above the line media, a lot of those things work for brand awareness, but I need to make sure that my team is accurately mapping back to attribution and making sure that we're spending dollars efficiently. There's a big narrative with the analysts crowd, of like your LTV to CAC, and making sure that we continue to keep that in mind as we build out. And when you start to get into some of these above the line channels and larger partnership deals with leagues or teams that have a big